Good afternoon and welcome to this ecoDa and Crowell&Moring joint webinar on the draft EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. We will ask ourselves what legal consequences there will be on companies and board members. So a very warm welcome from myself. My name is Alessandra Stabilini. And I sit on the board of ecoDa and on the board of NED Community, which is the Italian Association of Independent and Non-Executive Directors. So on behalf of ecoDa, and of course of Crowell&Moring as well, I wish to welcome you all to this webinar. I see that people is still joining, so we will maybe wait a couple of seconds before starting right away. We have a terrific panel today, so I am sure that we will be very happy and interested in what our panelists will have to tell us. May I remind our panelists of the time constraints? So may I ask all of you, please, to keep your speech within a 7-minute time. While I see that people is still joining, but since we have 1 hour and I want to use it all to hear what our panelists have to say, I will give the word right away to Anselme Mialon from the French Treasury, who will give us a very important context overview regarding the directive. And I am sure, I am personally very curious, Anselme, to hear your introduction to our panel. So I'll give you the word right away.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. Thank you very much for having me. And don't worry, Alessandra, I will keep these preliminary remarks very short. So you might ask, why is it that a French representative from the Treasury is invited? Well, that's because France, as you might know, presides the Council of the EU until the end of month. And so I will say a few words about where we stand as presidency of the Council of the EU as to the draft directive. But prior to that, I'd like to say a few words about the history of due diligence and then a few words about the French experiments, because you might know that France already legislated on this tricky area of due diligence with respect to human rights. So, first message I'd like to deliver today is to say that this draft directive as to due diligence on human rights did not come out of the blue, out of nowhere. Due diligence has already been addressed and dealt with as part of soft law since the 70s, actually. You first had an initiative from the International Labour Organization in the 70s, basically stating that companies had to deal with workforce-related abuses. And then in 2011, you had other guiding principle from the United Nations stating that companies should have responsibility with respect to human rights throughout their value chain, and as such had to identify, prevent, and mitigate, if need be, adverse impact in terms of human rights. And then you had some OECD guidelines stating that due diligence with respect to climate change, but also biodiversity, water wasted, or governance risk had to be operated by companies. But you really had a wake-up call in 2013 when you had a building in Bangladesh that collapsed, in which we found remnants of a label from Western retailers. So that really was a wake-up call for the international community, and you had a number of jurisdictions under the pressure of the amicable pressure of the civil society that started legislating. France was among one of those jurisdictions and had a law dating back to 2017. Law was very short, some would say very vague, and left a lot of answers, a lot of questions, unanswered. So if you really want to know what this law look like, you can search on the internet some so-called vigilance plans issued by French companies that have been translated into English. However, because that was really a pioneering law, this field, the scope was very narrow, and it is estimated that slightly over 250 companies need to comply with this law. Now, you also had other jurisdiction legislating, Germany, of course, last summer. And as a result of that, you had a bit of fear, I would say, of fragmentation as to this various national landscape. That's where the draft directive came in. That was very recent, last February. And so under the pressure of the European Parliament that made a resolution back in 2021, you had this ambitious legislation. I won't delve into the details because obviously that will be addressed by other panelists. Now, just to, and that will be my last word, where do we stand considering, as I said, that France holds the presidency of the Council of the EU until the end of June? I'll be very short because we have an obligation of neutrality as presidency. All I can say is that obviously France welcome as a principle this legislative proposal. President Emmanuel Macron said that we wanted to advance this area during the French presidency. We, as presidency, have already convened 3 meetings of the working group on company law. Next one will be end of May. Considering that company law working group is very busy right now working on CSRD, which is another very important piece of legislation dealing with reporting, currently under trilogue, and we expect to keep it closed and finalized under the French presidency. But what is for sure, and that will be my final word, we want to progress this file while addressing the issues of member states. Here again, I can't delve into too much details, but some of the questions, and I hope, and I'm sure there will be some of which will be addressed by other panelists, deal with smooth articulation with other pieces of legislation, such as CSRD that I already mentioned, but also international standards, such as OECD guidelines, with a challenge that is worth reflecting on, that comes with a challenge from shifting from soft law to hard law. I keep my preliminary remarks here, wishing all of you a very good seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Anselm, for this very, very interesting context speech, which I think is a perfect introduction to our 2 next panelists, Frédéric van Remortel and Sakina Yilmaz, both from Crowell&Moring Brussels, who will guide us with a short but comprehensive deep dive through the norms of the proposed directive and to the legal contents of this new instrument. So Frédéric and Sakina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandra. So as Alessandra announced, we will talk about the legal consequences of this directive. I will start with the timeline, the personal scope. I will then leave the floor to Frédéric for the due diligence process, and I will finish with the risk and the sanctions. So first, the timeline. As Anselm mentioned it, the draft was filed on February 23 by the EU Commission. A co-decision procedure will apply, which means that both the Parliament and the Council will have to approve this directive. There are several consequences, but it means that the directive will be amended on several aspects, probably before being amended. A co-decision procedure lasts between 18 months and 2 years, but in this present case, there was a public statement. The purpose is to adopt the directive next year, so before the end of the current legislature of the EU Parliament. The current step is the consultation of the public sector, and it will be closed on 23 of May. The EU Commission had to act via a directive because of the legal basis that was used. So Article 50 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU European Union. So it provides a minimum harmonization, which means that states can go further. And also it means that member states are the only destinatory of the directive. There is no direct effect on the companies. So there will be a national transposition within 2 years following the adoption of the directive. There will be also an additional transitional period of 2 years for companies in high impact sectors. Now that we have addressed the timeline, we can talk now about the company who are concerned. So the personal scope, we must do a distinction between 2 groups. First, EU companies, so companies formed in accordance with the legislation of a member state. And third, country non-EU companies, so companies formed according to the law of a third country. So first we have a first group, which is the largest EU companies, so more than 500 employees, and net worldwide turnover of more than 150 million euro. The reference year is the last financial year for which annual statements have been prepared. The second group is the larger mid-cap companies active in high-impact sectors. These are the companies with more than 250 employees and a net worldwide turnover of more than 40 million euros, and half of this turnover must be generated in high-impact sector. So it's clothing, minerals, forestry, agriculture, and so on. We have also the same criteria in terms of turnover for non-EU companies. The only difference is that for EU companies, we take the worldwide turnover, but for non-EU companies, we take the EU turnover because there must be a link with the EU, so the EU legislator can impose rules on third country companies. We have so several remarks. What does it mean in practice? It means that only 1% of the EU companies are concerned. So 13,000 EU companies and 4,000 non-EU companies. The criteria must be calculated at the level of the individual company, not the group, not on a consolidated basis. And this is different if we take also the French and the German legislation. This is quite important. Different. We have also different thresholds and obligation. And so I can refer to the comment of Anselm regarding that it will be difficult sometimes to articulate the different instruments and to attain full harmonization and level playing fields for companies. So I can give the floor to Frédéric for the due diligence obligation.
Thank you, Sakine. So indeed, these are the, I hear an echo, I don't know. Yeah, and we have here listed the main obligations under the current draft directive, because of course we're talking about a draft. And these are the main obligations. It is, for some of you who have been following this subject matter, these obligations are not very new. I mean, someone already referred on some, I think, to the OECD due diligence guidance. If you take that document, you will see that actually all these obligations come back and these various steps come back. So they are not very new. And that's why I think that in general, probably these various obligations, these main obligations will be maintained with some changes, of course, but the general obligations will stay, I think. So quickly going or trying to go through the various obligations. First point, integrate human rights and environmental due diligence into the corporate policies and have in place a separate due diligence policy. So the companies within scope, of course, should have a due diligence policy that sets out the long-term approach of the company for meeting these requirements. It of course does not mean that they just have to commit to complying with those. No, the company will have to actually indicate how they will concretely proceed in order to meet the requirements. And there will of course have to be a balance, because if you're going too much in detail, too prescriptive for yourself, you of course increase your own risk of liability or of litigation. The due diligence policy should contain a code of conduct, which contains the rules to be followed by employees and subsidiaries, and also describing the processes to put in place the due diligence. We've also mentioned here that for the larger companies, so of group 1 that Sakine has described, also a plan must be adopted to ensure that the strategy of and the business model of the company is compatible with the Paris Agreement. So this is also something that has been largely debated already, because this is actually an obligation of states that is now put on private enterprises. Second step or second obligation is then identifying actual or potential adverse impacts to the environment and to human rights. How are you going to do that? Well, you have to look at the annexes to the draft directive, where there is a list of international treaties and other documents that provide information about human rights and climate protection instruments. And those will have to be evaluated, those obligations, and incorporated into the due diligence process. One approach could be, I'm not a French lawyer, of course, but I understand that under the French legislation, there is an obligation to do some kind of a risk mapping. And so the first step would be to look at the instruments that are in the annexes, then distill from that a smaller list of instruments that are relevant for the activities of the company, and then try to classify the possible adverse impact for this company according to the severity and the likelihood. And so it's kind of a risk-based approach, I would say. I also do some GDPR work now and then, and I often compare it with the risk mapping that you also do under the GDPR, and where you also, as a company, have to take into account the accountability principle and say, okay, these general obligations exist, but how am I going to implement these into my system, into my operations? Next step is then prevent and mitigate potential adverse impacts, and bring the actual possible impacts where there was no prevention possible, bring them to an end. There again, the directive lists various actions that have to be undertaken. Sometimes we get the comment that it's not very detailed. It's true, but on the other hand, I think there are quite a bit of details in the draft directive already and in the recitals. So for instance, they should, where necessary, develop and implement a prevention action plan in consultation with affected stakeholders. They should seek contractual assurances from business partners, make investments as required in management systems, provide support to SMEs, etc. So that's for the prevention. When there would be an adverse impact, then we have to neutralize the impact, for instance, by paying a financial compensation to affected communities or populations. I see that the time is running, so I will go over to the complaints procedure. So companies have to implement a complaints procedure where, for instance, several listed persons can, based on reasonable grounds to believe that there may be an adverse impact, file a complaint. It comes a bit on top, I think, of the possibilities that already exist under the EU Whistleblowing Directive and in implementing national laws. Next step, monitoring the effectiveness of their due diligence policies. And last but not least, publish on the website an annual statement on due diligence policies by April 30th of each year. So that's very precise. Next slide, please. So all these obligations relate not only for their own operations, but also for the subsidiaries of the companies concerned and the entities with whom they have an established business relationship. So it's actually concerning the entire value chain, which is, of course, something that has been much debated, this broad scope. As mentioned, it concerns two elements, environment and human rights, both listed in the annex. And as mentioned as well, these obligations are not new, and so we often receive the request, yeah, but what do we have to do in practice? This is all very vague. Then I can recommend to, for instance, go and check the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, which is very practical, I think, and which lists really what you can do, which divisions of a company need to be involved, etc. It's a very interesting document, I think. It's 100 pages, so it's good literature for the weekend. And I think that's the end of my intervention. So I give the word back to Sakine with respect to the risks and sanctions.
Sakine, thank you very much, Frederic. I hate to do this, but this is part of my job as moderator. So Sakine, I am asking you to be really, really short and effective because we are running a bit out of time. Thank you very much.
So for the first item, the internal complaint procedure, I will not come back to that because Frederic already addressed this question. Member states will have to appoint national supervisory authorities, so they could start investigation on their own following a complaint, and they could impose financial fines, administrative fines to companies. The third element of sanction is civil liability. So it will be a matter of national law. Common civil liability rules will apply. So we will need a fault, a causal link, and a damage. Causation, evidencing causation could be difficult in climate litigation. Also, the directive confirmed that the whistleblowing directive will apply. And the last point is our Article 25 regarding director's duty. It confirmed that the directors are the body competent to putting in place the due diligence action, and they must take into account short, medium, long-term consequences of the decision for sustainability matters. So I think I will keep it to that for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Frederic as well. This was, I think, very helpful and gave us a very good base to pass on the floor to Lena Lindmeyer. Lena is Secretary General of the Institute of Directors Finland, and also, and I say this proudly, the chairwoman of ecoDa. Lena will give us an idea of ecoDa's position and feedback and reflections on this proposal. Lena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandra, and good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be allowed to tell about ecoDa reactions, and there are quite many reactions to this proposal. First of all, ecoDa is very pleased to be promoting sustainability, which we see is really a strategic core issue for companies, and we feel that our member institutes directors are at the heart of making sustainability the core issue of companies. So this is not something news to us. It is something that we are definitely working on. And for example, at DIF, Directors Institute Finland, our annual seminar tomorrow will be on sustainability and supply chain. So it's a core topic for us. There is a tremendous change going on, and one of the issues in this project is that the existing statistics are old, on which the proposal may be based on. And the fact is that detailed legislation may hamper development in the future when change is going on, and the ideas in this proposal are based on older practices. Also, company law is not harmonized in the EU, and this will result in an unclear directive. There are also some questions of the subsidiarity principle, that are some of these articles actually even allowed to be given on EU level when the national laws actually stipulate much of it. One of the worries that we have is that will this directive lead to excessive legal disputes? Very much of the emphasis in this proposal is on complaints and sanctions, which were already covered on the previous speaker's presentation. So, for example, I might question that if there is a smaller company, not a very small, as we know there are thresholds, but somebody who is actually rather green in their operations, but is not so keen on making all these plans and channels, etc., that need to be done, compared to a huge company which is totally brown, actually polluting a lot, but doing all the bureaucracy. So is it so that this actually to the core company that is good, but maybe not understanding some of the bureaucracy, will be sanctioned, although it is not polluting or doing harm? So this is something that, what is the idea, to fulfill the bureaucracy or to promote sustainability? Also, there are overlapping initiatives of the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, taxonomy, etc. And one thing that seems to have been forgotten is the role of the corporate governance codes in the different countries, which actually are a very powerful tool with the comply or explain mechanism, because companies, especially larger ones, cannot look bad to the public and to the investors. And we know currently that the investors are very much stressing on this topic. I hear every day from our members that indeed investors are more and more interested. But talking about the investments, to make the world the better place and save us from the catastrophe of climate change, huge private investments will be needed. And the thing is that if there will be unclear, risky legislation in Europe, these investments may be taken outside the EU. And this needs to be really thought very carefully, that are we going to get the investments that are billions and thousands of billions? I don't even understand the sums of money that we're talking about. Whereas the sustainability issue should be everybody's business. This proposal directive seems to be geared to the companies, not to the societies as a whole. And for example, at the last moment, public tenders were deleted from the directive. They were planned to be there, that there would be sustainability criteria, but for some reason or other, it's not there. Shouldn't it be so that the societies, when they use huge amounts of public money, they also should be keen on using sustainability criteria? So I don't understand at all this solution that was made. Going further to supply chains, actually the directive uses the term value chain, which to us seems very vague and very extremely far-reaching. And an interesting thing, when you look at this proposal, when it refers to existing legislation in the EU or the global level, the term is supply chain. So what is going on here? Why is this value chain, and which will cause confusion, because we are very much afraid that it will go very, very far. As for Articles 25 and 26 on directors' duties, we find them very unclear, confusing also. Are managers to some extent confused to directors in these articles? And besides, in most EU countries, I would imagine, certainly in my own one, there is national legislation, very clear national legislation directors' duties, and regarding the subsidiarity principle, it's not very clear that is this a proper tool to add overlapping legislation. And as for the remuneration, Article 15, there is a huge change going on now. Companies are adding currently sustainability criteria to their remuneration schemes. And definitely the change is as to the weight of these criteria, the use of these criteria, and also we made a survey among our members this spring that it is also going more towards long-term incentives, whereas previously it was mostly in short-term incentives. So I would urge the Commission, the EU, to find out what is actually going on. This spring and next spring, the companies will report very much different, very much larger remuneration schemes based on these criteria. And besides the Article 15, I don't even fully understand what it means. It is so vague. And reminding also that the Shareholders' Rights Directive already has remuneration related to non-financial topics. Well, there are many question marks here, and ecoDa, and as well as our national institutes, we would be, of course, very happy to have extensive education programs, which many of us do, but hopefully the European Commission will also have some funding for our work in the different EU countries to promote sustainability, because surely education is needed, but not so much detailed legislation overlapping national legislation, other European legislation, and causing perhaps even US-style litigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. So somehow problematic, this new instrument and piece of law. So thank you very much for so effectively sketching the various problematic issues that are inside this legal text. I will now pass the floor to Daniela Matthews. Daniela Matthews is co-managing partner at the European Centre for Board Efficiency. And I will certainly leave you the floor, Daniela, to give us a little bit of the German perspective on all this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and many thanks for having me. As I said, I was asked to bring a bit of the German perspective into the discussion. And as somebody told before, Germany took the chance to put its own law in place last year. And this was considering a sustainable supply chain. The discussion overall was quite critically, and companies feel themselves a little bit over-demanded, but nevertheless, the law is in place and the boards need to react, and they will. Maybe some of you might think that the directive will not affect Germany companies anymore and so much, but I can tell you the other way is around. And the other way around will be the case. There is some important differences, or there are some important differences between the German supply chain law and the SDD directive, which is focusing, as somebody told before, on the whole value chain, and this is a huge difference. And now let me just point some few differences out, and I think this shows pretty well that the way the European way for harmonized legislation, there is some way to go still. First of all, there's already a huge difference in the question who has to apply the law. The German law is mandatory only for all companies who are located in Germany and has more than 3,000 employees. And it doesn't matter which legal form they apply. They have to apply these new law from January 2020. Companies with more than 1,000 employees have to apply. As you can see, there is no criteria around revenues or turnover, and it's also not important in which sector you are working. So that means there are much more lower barriers for the companies which have then to react on the directive. Secondly, while the EU is considering the whole value chain in the directive, the German regulator only focused and mainly focused on the supply chain, which means all transactions directly and indirectly upstream, not downstream from a company. All direct suppliers are those you have a permanent or a direct contract or engagement to the company, and there are other suppliers which have only indirect business relationships. This difference is important because the management has a different duty to those which have only indirect a relationship to the company. You only have to consider the duty and the supply chain in that case if you know that there maybe are some breaks of the rules, for instance, on human rights. In any other cases, that means if you have a direct related supplier, you have to follow up that this supplier has followed the rules in sustainability and also in human rights aspects. But which are the duties of our German law? There is, when I saw on the slide before, not so much difference between the EU directive and the German law when it comes to processes, monitoring elements, to ensure a proper supply chain and to communicate to the public. But more important is that the German law is not considering the strategic impact of the topic, which the EU directive does. It means there are no demands by law so far for the German management to integrate sustainability in the company's strategy and to think how to bring the economical, the sustainability, and the social aspects in balance. In listed companies, we know that it takes care of in the future, and I'm personally convinced that it's important to bring the shareholder and the stakeholder interest in a kind of balance. And the main question for myself is, in the nearest future, how to consider which stakeholder interest, how to balance their interest with shareholder interest, and how to communicate. And all these aspects are addressed in a way by the EU directive, but not in the German law. Finally, from a German perspective, we also need to interpret the directive in our two-tier system. What does it mean? Mainly, the executive management has to apply to the new rules. The supervisory board has to monitor. But when it comes to the question, what we are all talking about, to climate change, ensure sustainability business, so we all know that boards has much more to do than just to supervise or to monitor. There needs to be a kind of motivator, sparring partner, thought leader, however. And in that fact, boards need to discuss with management long-term strategies, discuss scenarios, discuss new kind of remuneration. Lina, you mentioned that, and also discuss how this fits together with the shareholders and the stakeholder interest. Having said this, I am personally convinced that boards' roles and their behavior needs to change quickly so that they really have an impact on this in this journey. But I guess I decided to this later in our panel discussion. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Very interesting indeed. And some of the remarks that you made are specific to Germany, but some are actually will actually be a common problem for various states of the European Union. I'll then pass the floor to Andrew Blasi. I apologize, Andrew, for allowing myself to pronounce your name all'Italien. And Andrew will give us a very important point of view, which is the US point of view. I'll only add that Andrew is a director at Crowell&Moring International. And I'm leaving you the floor, Andrew.
Thank you so much. Greetings, everyone. It's an honor to be here today. Thank you to ecoDa and my colleagues at Crowell in Brussels for the kind invitation. And I'm really looking forward to providing a high-level perspective on US ESG-related initiatives and developments. So we can go to the next slide. As Alessandro mentioned, my name is Andrew Blasey, and I'm a director at Crowell&Moring International based in Washington, and I lead our team's ESG corporate governance and ethics and compliance portfolios. Before I delve right in, I also want to quickly thank my colleague, Chris Gunderman, who you see on the slide, who's been a tremendous partner in helping to prepare our thoughts for you today from the US perspective. We can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to take all of you, I know many of us are joining today from across Europe. I'm going to take all of you on a quick three-part journey across the pond. First, I'm going to talk about the rise of ESG in the United States, and we're going to take a look at some recent developments together, the current state of play, as well as where ESG in the US is going next. So next slide, please. First, let's talk a bit about the rise of ESG. So as the saying goes in the United States, follow the money. It's important to first talk about the tremendous amount of financial inflows that have taken place into sustainable and ESG-related investments. I think for the US Forum on Sustainable and Responsible Investment found that it's already identified over $17 trillion in assets under management as far ago as 2019 focused on sustainable investment strategies. This investment has been partnered with dramatic increases in investor interest about broader firm sustainability behavior and ESG related issues. But, and this is the big but, currently in the United States, ESG reporting frameworks are voluntary and many offer conflicting appraisals of companies. This has led to tremendous confusion for many investors. Companies are craving clarity on ESG reporting rather than dealing, as we all know, with a myriad of different standards. When the US Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, sought to examine whether standardization of ESG metrics would be desired, and this took place not too long ago, it received over 550 unique comments. Importantly, over 75% of those comments were in favor of increased or mandatory ESG disclosures, really indicating a demand for increased and more consistent disclosure. Now, as I mentioned, the US and the EU have taken really different ESG strategies. Importantly, the US is following a laissez-faire approach with sustainability disclosure that's principally led by voluntary private sector-led processes and protocols. The advancement of this effort is largely driven, we should say, by peer pressure and a desire to differentiate. So this has led, frankly, and you'll hear me talk about this in a moment, led to greater accusations of what we hear of as greenwashing, right? And I don't think we should be surprised as we look into the future to hear accusations of things like diversity washing or even ethics washing. The EU is employing a systematic and centralized approach towards ESG and sustainability, and it is deploying a slew of regulatory and legal measures to accelerate ESG disclosure within the bloc, right, including the CSRD, which we heard about earlier. So that gives you a sense of the rise in situation up until current within the US. So let's go to the next slide to assess the state of play. And this is, I think, what will be of most interest to the listeners. By now, many of you have heard that the US Securities and Exchange Commission has proposed a new environmental disclosure rule set for firms, and it's instituted increased employee and workforce disclosures in late 2020 with more to come in the near future. So if we think about the rules that would and have first been mandated ESG related disclosures for American businesses, the SEC rules were drawn heavily from the TFCD, or Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Standards, or the GGP. Importantly, these proposed rules by the SEC would require registrants to report several things, and I'll just cover some of the main ones very quickly. First, a company's climate-related risks and any actual or likely materials impacts on businesses, the firm's governance of climate-related risks and relevant risk management processes, the business's greenhouse gas emissions, and importantly, I would say in this case, large and accelerated filers would be subject to assurance. Again, and in addition to this, certain climate-related financial statement metrics and information about climate-related targets and goals, and frankly, transition plans too, if any. It should be noted that the SEC's environmentally focused move is not without political ramifications, unsurprisingly, as most things are in the United States today. Republican members of the US Congress, for those who are followers of the US political system, have indicated that the SEC has really overstepped its authority. And we're paying close attention to, should the Republican Party in the US take back control of the US Congress this November, we should be expecting some antagonistic congressional hearings on this topic in 2023. The SEC rules enacted are also almost certain, and I know I've seen some comments about litigation, they're almost certainly to be challenged in the courts. And frankly, we may even see these reach the US Supreme Court, which I think, as we all have seen this week, is also not without its own politics in the United States. Now, quickly, before I move on from the current state of play, I want to talk about things separate from the environment, because this is important as we think about the S and the G elements of ESG. The SEC has also released a rule in 2020 requiring listed firms to disclose their human capital management, right? So this is to the extent such disclosure is material to an understanding of a company's business taken as a whole. This was a principles-based approach that didn't really allow for comparability. In fact, I would say employees are more material in some industries, as we know, than others. So proponents argue that this rule didn't go far enough, and the SEC indicated a new human capital management disclosure rule in its late spring of 2021 regulatory agenda. That has not been released yet. So I think, again, something to focus here. So, however, I'll say this, our use of the word minimal on this slide, it's important to take this a step further. The SEC has largely declined thus far to pursue guidance more broadly related to the S and the G components. So this means, quite frankly, that we should expect to see some potential divergence in the time period ahead between S and G standards across the Atlantic, and are likely not to be resolved in the near future. Folks, we are paying attention to some state level action in the United States in places like California, which have started to focus on human capital management, but even those are facing an uphill battle. So US-based companies or corporations are really facing an unprecedented wave of shareholder resolutions focused on ESG in 2022. With the amount of shareholder resolutions, this is quite interesting, up 22% since 2021. And in 2021, there was actually a record of a 300% increase in ESG related investment suits. So I think we're starting to see, obviously, this divergence that's emerged in the path that the US is taking. So in the interest of time, I think we'll go to the last and final slide, which is just to sum up, where is the United States going from here on ESG? Bottom line, the future of the SEC's rule remains uncertain. And even if it stands, quite frankly, the US attempts to impose, it's unlikely that I would say the US will attempt to impose mandatory S&G rules outside of the employee disclosure, at least in the near term. Failure to do so, right? Failure would really, as mentioned, really widen that gulf between the US and the EU on the spectrum of ESG. Now, if the SEC's environmental disclosure rules stand, firms are obviously likely to accelerate their compliance with TFCD and GGP standards. So this would potentially put more US firms in alignment with the EU standards. Now, at the same time, and irrespective of my previous point, if investors are unlikely to lessen the pressure they're putting on corporate boards. So we should expect, regardless of what happens, these pressures will continue to advance in the United States, though perhaps in a decentralized format. So bottom line, we should expect many multinational US firms in particular, regardless of size or perhaps dependent on size, from what some of the other panelists were mentioning, in terms of where firms might come into alignment, we should expect a focus on compliance with EU and other ESG disclosure standards that likely exceed US requirements, at least in the near term. So with that, Alessandra, I will turn the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This was extremely interesting. And actually, from all the panelists' remarks, I think there is so much food for thought that I would just like to ask you a million questions, but I will refrain from that. So I will limit myself and I'll put on the table a first round of 2-3 questions, which I ask our panelists to react very freely. So you can choose which question to react to and what angle to take. And in the meantime, I would like to remind everyone, please, if you have any question, put it in the chat section and I will pick up at least some of them for our panelists. So my first question, just to kick off, would be, well, first, Frederic and Sakine touched on Article 25 of the draft directive, which is a quite peculiar norm in that it touches directly on directors' duties and liabilities. So my question is, what does that article mean? What is the potential scope of this norm? How will this impact on existing legislation? And ultimately, that is clearly a very interesting question here. What changes, if anything, for corporate directors in the European Union? Second question would be, what about small and medium enterprises? We know that at least in the European definition, SMEs are somehow exempted from this directive, but there are a few problematic issues here. First, there are SMEs that do not fall below the threshold. And one other problematic issue is, since there are a lot of SMEs in the European Union as we know it, would this be a limit to the effectiveness of the directive anyhow? And a third question that might be interesting in my opinion is there a risk of disengagement in some countries as an unintended consequence of the draft directive? So whoever wants to start, I don't know if Anselm is still with us and wishes to react. Lena, yes, please take the floor. Yes, and the other panelists can very well use the raise hand button if you want to react. Lena.
Thank you, Alessandra. As for the unintended consequences, it's not possible that the European companies would take care of the whole global supply chain problems. And it might happen that, for example, some African countries might not be up to these requirements. So will this lead to the fact that some European companies will abandon Africa and leave it actually to the Chinese? So this is even a geopolitical question that has this been thought to the end. As for the SMEs, my topic is that when you look at the article regarding the contractual chain, there needs to be, and the big companies have a lot of pressure, weight on the smaller ones. Actually, the smaller ones will be in a very difficult situation because they will not be able to sell in the supply chains unless they're able to provide everything that the big companies want. And as for the Article 25, I haven't met anybody who really understands what it is all about. I'm very glad to hear if somebody can explain to me. If I understand correctly, it's not in the civil liability article this article referred to, so I'm not sure how it will turn out. And somebody please tell me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. I think Frederic is the best place to give us a little bit of light regarding Article 25. Frederic, do you want to take the floor?
Yes, no, I just wanted to confirm your reading, Lena, that indeed it is difficult to understand, and this article and what it says and what it adds to existing obligations of directors. It applies only to the way I read it, only applies to directors of the EU companies, so not of the foreign companies, because of course you cannot infringe, I think, as an EU legislator on company law from non-EU companies. But I think directors have a duty of care in any event to make sure that international treaties and obligations that are imposed on companies are also followed by the board. And there, you don't need this article. I can refer to the Shell case in the Netherlands, where they also have said, okay, as a director, you have a duty of care to make sure that the soft law is complied with. And so the only thing I see is that here you would have a direct obligation on directors, but I don't know whether this increases a possible liability of directors. We also see that in case law that already exists in the Netherlands, in France, it's mainly the companies who are sued and not the directors, possibly also, of course, because there are much more funds available with the company than with the directors. But I think that's it makes it clear that directors are responsible to set up these systems and to implement them. But again, I think that this is also true under just national existing company law. So again, I don't know what it adds. I also think it's poorly written, because it also, for instance, says, that's in Article 26, I think, that the directors have to report to the board of directors. So what does that mean? Is there a confusion between the director's function and the executive function, the management function? So yeah, all this to say that I agree with you that it's not very good written, and I assume that there will be changes to these articles in the months ahead.
Thank you very much, Frederic. Any other panelists want to react to these first questions? Otherwise, Sakina, yes, please.
Yeah, I just have a few remarks on SMEs. So I agree with Lena that the purpose should not to impose the burden on SMEs, but the directive gives on several aspects on how to help SMEs in this context. So the Commission said that there will be some support measure for SMEs. So portals, website, financial support, so it's important. There is also an important rules in the directive which says that if being compliant with the diligence obligation would financially jeopardize the viability of the SMEs, it's upon the large company, which is under the scope of the directive, to help SME to be compliant. So now it's difficult to know how it will implement, in which case, how, but these are first elements of response. And I think the purpose of the directive is not to impose that on SMEs. So it's a first, there are first element. And regarding disengagement, I think that we should take into account that, okay, companies have to prevent human rights impacts and bring an end to high impact, to adverse impacts. So it could mean that they could disengage from a country where there are systemic violation of human rights, but they should also consider that when leaving, they could create new adverse impact on human rights for workers and this kind of thing. So I think there should be a balance also. So the answer is not white or black, it's more a gray area. So I think it's not so clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakina. Andrew.
And Alessandra, I promise to be very, very quick. One comment, one thought. The first, for those with interest, the SEC's proposed ESG rule, under that, the majority of disclosures for publicly traded companies would be in effect regardless of the firm's size. So I think that that's just an important note. The legislation, however, does provide a safe harbor for liability from what we call Scope 3 emissions disclosure, as well as an exemption from Scope 3 emissions disclosure for smaller reporting companies, right? So there's different categories. So I point that out from a US perspective. Maybe just as a quick personal comment, because as someone, I've worked with small and medium-sized enterprises for well over a decade in a range of areas, including in such areas as ethics and compliance. While certainly the burdens of this, we need to make sure we're protecting small and medium-sized companies from losing competitiveness and whatnot, I would just issue a slight note of caution that I also think, in particular, as we see capital flows increasingly directing themselves towards sustainability, and as we see not just the US and the European Union looking at ESG, but other markets around the world, including in the Asia Pacific region, I would just urge a degree of caution on voice of SMEs sort of being carved out from the importance of pursuing sustainability strategies for both long-term competitiveness. And frankly, I think as you mentioned, Alessandra, there's an importance here to not just the role of larger companies across supply chains, as Lana noted, but to the extent governments desire sustainability within their societies, they, I think, also have a burden to support SMEs in some capacity, right? Achieve those higher degrees of sustainability. So I just put that out there for us as a wider business community to make sure that we're also climbing up that higher value and sustainability, but doing so in a way that actually strengthens competitiveness and doesn't hurt it.
Thank you very much, Andrea. This is a very interesting remark indeed that you have just made. I'll pick up one question, and we have just 3 minutes left from the chat, so from the audience. The question is clearly a $1 billion question. And the question is, what do we make, or how do we manage all this long-term view of business with what is happening right now that somehow strike us down to the very short-term problems, energy, inflation, war. So how can businesses, how can European and non-European undertakings keep a long-term view when the short-term is so compelling, unfortunately? So I know it's a horribly difficult question. I'm very glad I am not the one who has to answer. Lena, yes.
I think there is a tremendous difference between companies, how much this terrible situation is affecting them. For some, it is a super crisis never before seen. And for others, there are difficulties, but such that do not prevent them to take care of the other sustainability issues. So one size does not fit all, and I don't like the timing of this directive at the moment, because it will be very difficult if the crisis continues for several years. If the crisis is short, the directive will take several years. So okay, fine, but currently some companies are really suffering, their employees are suffering, and I hope there will be understanding. And of course, in the long run, this situation will lead to more sustainable energy solutions. There will be very many innovations, etc., but it does not happen overnight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena. So interesting times are ahead of us, a little more peaceful than they are at the moment, I hope. And if no other panelist wishes to add anything on the topic, I will only thank you all very much. So a big thank you to all our panelists for a very interesting and terrific discussion. And of course, thanks to all our participants for being so kind to follow us. I know that other questions will come, so I absolutely encourage all the audience to reach out to our panelists through ecoDa. or Crowell, so to have the possibility to interact afterwards with them. So thank you all very much and have a very good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Goodbye.